I recently had to take a 4-hour train ride and decided to buy the latest edition of Der Spiegel to read whilst I was on it. The title story was on Merkel's sudden fall from grace and comparing her to prior chancellors who, through their own hubris, became out of touch with their colleagues and the voters and fell from grace. And as I opened the magazine, this fell out. A printed letter asking me to take part in a survey on the US elections, with which I could win a holiday in South America. I expected a questionnaire of 10 or so questions, at least, but in total there were only 5 questions in this questionnaire. The candidate for the American presidency, Donald Trump, demands an immigration ban on Muslims from terror states. Does this, in your opinion, stand contrary to democratic principles? Do you believe that Donald Trump, despite the expectations from his critics, will be a positive surprise? Do you believe that her prior position as Secretary of State especially qualifies Hillary Clinton for the office of President? With Angela Merkel in Germany, Theresa May in the UK, and possibly Hillary Clinton in the USA, 3 big Western nations would lie in female hands. Do you think this would change global politics for the better? Both Trump and Clinton have announced that they would quit trade agreements to protect the domestic economy. Do you fear disadvantages for the export-based economy in Germany? You can think of these questions and how biased they may or may not be as much as you want. My main gripe with it, and this might sound weird to some, is that this questionnaire was in there and how the US presidential elections have dominated European news media these past months. Now, don't get me wrong, yes, sure, the US elections are important and of global significance, but certain aspects of it are starting to annoy me. Things that have less to do with the US election itself, but with the European reaction to it. Do you know that the port of Thessaloniki was privatized last year? Thessaloniki is a major European trading port, one of the biggest in the Mediterranean and of enormous significance both for the Greek and European economies. It was sold to Chinese investors who will now probably fire most of the Greek workers, thereby adding more strain on the city of Thessaloniki and Greece at large, and will replace those fired Greeks with cheap imported Chinese contract labor. This is a big deal. Hundreds, if not thousands of Greeks thrown into poverty, further strain on the Greek economy, and the Chinese gaining control over a very important European economic asset. Yet I remember distinctively how the main title stories throughout the European media landscape were some things along the lines of Trump said something naughty and Hillary said this in response. At times it seems as if many within the European media had the delusion that no matter how bad things are going to be in Europe right now, as long as the preferred candidate won the election, all the problems of Europe would just go away. That Trump or Clinton will fix a broken European Union, end the migrant and refugee crisis, end the economic crisis in the Mediterranean, end the Muslim self-segregation problem, end terrorism in Europe, and resolve all the issues we are having. And that in an American election in which the emphasis is more on domestic issues rather than foreign issues. The entire thing reminds me a bit of the pointless euphoria when Obama was elected, especially right now where the situation on the European continent is probably even worse than it was in 2008. It doesn't matter which US presidential candidate will be elected, neither of them will resolve the issues at hand on the European continent. That can only be achieved if the attention that the European public gives that election can be reshifted to focus on European happenings. Before the current year even ends, there will be a presidential election in Austria contested between a right-wing candidate and the Green candidate, which, if the right-wing candidate wins, could see the government being forced into resignation, triggering a parliamentary election for 2017. Keep in mind that Austria, unlike Germany, immediately implemented a immigration quota when the migrant and refugee crisis started, and played a big role in shutting down the Balkan route together with Serbia, Croatia and Hungary. This was done by a social democratic conservative coalition government which, despite those actions, is still being punished by the public. In Italy there will also be a constitutional referendum on amending the constitution to change the Italian Senate from having its members elected by regions to being appointed by regional government institutions. If that referendum fails, the Italian Prime Minister Renzi is likely to resign, out of which a re-election in 2017 could also be a possibility. In 2017 itself, we will see elections in the Czech Republic, but of course the big elections that year will be the French presidential elections, the German parliamentary elections, and the UK parliamentary elections. Couple this with the possibility of an election in Italy, and you end up with four big geopolitical players in Europe all having elections at roughly the same time during one of the most volatile and turbulent times Europe has gone through since the end of the Second World War. You might have not noticed this, but whilst a lot of European attention was focused on Clinton complaining about frogs, the Mediterranean European Union member states had a meetup prior to the upcoming EU meetup in Bratislava and have been laying out plans for a Club Med, a club for Mediterranean EU members, France, Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Malta and Cyprus, to counter the Northern European dominance over the European Union and its resulting policy initiatives. The future of that project will depend on who wins the French elections and how the constitutional referendum in Italy will go. The UK election will ultimately determine what kind of Brexit deal the UK will make with the EU, and is the first time in what has to be 40 or 50 years that the UK could see a left-wing government come to power, which is already running on election promises unthinkable a couple of years ago, such as the renationalisation of Britain's rail services. This would then mean that Europe would get its second far-left leader after Alexis Tsipras in Greece, possibly setting a political trend for all of Europe. In Germany, the current political situation might push the Conservative Party into splitting up into a moderate Conservative Party and a right-wing Conservative Party. Polls suggest that after this election, Germany will probably have a right-wing political presence in its parliament for the first time ever in the Second Republic. In such an event, there is a possibility that Germany will end up with a right-wing conservative coalition government, ending the era Merkel, who had preferred to govern with Social Democrats in coalition. The Conservatives might also push Merkel out for a new coalition government with the Social Democrats, which would also make someone new chancellor. If that scenario becomes true, there's no way we can really tell what would happen, since after a decade of the same person dominating over German politics, it would be a completely new start. I believe that the main focus of a new post-Merkel era government would be on picking up the shambles she left and trying to rebuild something out of what she ruined. Germany currently is isolated in Europe due to its policy and is going to face increasing problems due to its open border policy. In the Czech Republic, the elections, according to the current polls, predict that the Social Democratic, Christian Democratic and Liberal Democratic coalition government will remain in power. I'd guess that's because they decided not to bow to European Union and German pressure during the refugee and migrant crisis, which would have been suicidal anyway, since an estimated 2/3 of the Czech public are against open borders for Middle Eastern migrants and refugees. However, the most important election of the year 2017, in my opinion, will be neither the UK or the German elections, but the French presidential elections. You would have to live under a rock if you don't know what has been going on in France over the course of the last 2 years. Before the wave of terror that broke over France, the political debate in that country was focused more on economic difficulties, and under Sarkozy on possible privatization of the massive state industries. This has by now completely shifted. Never mind his past privatization ideas. Sarkozy is now campaigning on a platform where he wants to outright ban the wearing of hijabs in public, and on the ticket that he wants to get rid of the famous right to soil law, which guarantees French citizenship to everyone born in France. The political debate in France has completely and totally reshifted towards the dangerous impact which the self-segregated and hostile Muslim communities have had on French society. And Islam by now is pretty much the top election issue in France. The right-wing Front National, of course, campaigned on this issue for decades, and it is expected that after the first round of voting is done, one of the two remaining candidates for president will be Le Pen. The question remains if the other candidate will be Sarkozy or Hollande. What, however, happened in France, which is much more significant to me as a left-leaning liberal, and in my opinion to the rest of this continent, is the change in attitude which the French left has gone through towards Islam. Complaints about Islamophobia would not only look pathetic, but just be outright offensive and disgusting in a society where Islam butchers hundreds and where Muslim gangs behave like Nazi brown shirts in 1930s Germany. President Hollande has so far not only been the only left-leaning politician, but also the only national leader of a European country who has dared to openly proclaim that his country was at war and had to fight for its values against an Islamic enemy. Whilst his Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, has proposed bans on hijabs in universities, vocally supported the burkini ban, and has very openly attacked the Islamic cultural and religious values for being undemocratic and in complete opposition to French values. The realization is starting to sink in within the French left that the barbarism which Islam has brought to French shores is not just an expression of a fringe, but the symptoms of a religious culture that stands at odds with modernity and the values of a free society. As such, out of all left-leaning movements in Europe, it has been the French left who are the first to finally break free out of the toxic alliance with Islam. And being left-wing myself, I have to hope that Hollande wins the French election and that Manuel Valls remains French Prime Minister, or at the very least succeeds Hollande. From France, we could see the beginning of a left-wing political movement with the goal of finally ending the protective umbrella that so many regressive leftists have built over Islam and its backwards and authoritarian nature. A left wing that confronts Islam rather than protects it is something desperately needed, especially here in Europe. And as such, if the current course continues, I will probably be vocally supporting Hollande and Valls in the upcoming French elections. I hope that with the encroaching end of the US election cycle coming up, we will be capable of covering these European topics more frequently, and that several of my European colleagues will also join in. Auf Wiedersehen.